Hello everyone, welcome to our YouTube channel Testing Gyan. In our today's video we are going to learn about exception handling in Java. So before that, first we should understand what is exception and error. Exception is an unwanted or unexpected event in your Java program which disrupts the execution flow or basically terminates your execution. Whereas error is something which indicates a serious problem in your program or application. Exception can be handled, but it is not recommended to handle the errors because error is something which is serious. Now let us see what are the different type of exceptions. So there are two type of exceptions: checked exceptions and unchecked exceptions. Checked exceptions are also called compile time exceptions because this is something which is notified by compiler that your program can throw such exception. Whereas unchecked exceptions are called runtime exceptions because these happens at the time of execution. The example of checked exception is find not found exception, and for unchecked exception example is null pointer exceptions. Now if we look at the hierarchy diagram, under throwable class we are having exception and the error class. Exception is having two types, checked and unchecked, and error is having like virtual machine error or some assertion error, etc. So now let us see how we can produce these exceptions in our Java program. To understand this, I have created this program where I have created one method called compile time. Under this method, first I have created the file object and then I have created the file reader object. If you see, compiler is telling me one error here. If we look at the error, compiler is telling me to add throws declaration or surround with try catch. So this is how exceptions are handled. So as my program is throwing some compile time or checked exception, so compiler is suggesting me to handle it. So if I add this throws declaration here, my exception will be handled. As you can see, this is a find not found exception. Now similarly, let us take a look at the runtime exception. So for that I have created this example. In here if you see, I have created one empty string or a null string, and then I'm trying to print the length of that particular string. So if I run this particular method here, so you will see it will throw me a runtime exception, which is null pointer exception. So this is how exceptions can occur in your program. So these are the unwanted events which can hamper my execution flow. So these should be handled. Now let us see how we can handle the exceptions. To handle exceptions in Java, there are 5 important keywords: try, catch, finally, throw, and throws. Now let us see how we can use these keywords to handle the exceptions. Now in this program we have already seen the usage of throws. So throws doesn't mean like it has handled the exception, it is simply indicating like my method is throwing this exception. So even if I run my program, if I run this method here, you will see even after the throw statement it will terminate the execution, and here also it is indicating me to add the throws declaration. So that is, even when I'm calling this, I have to add this throws declaration to the main method as well, or I have to add the try catch, which will in actual handle the exception. So if you see, even then my program is not executed properly, it is throwing the exception. Okay, now let us see how we can handle the exception. To handle the exception, there is a concept of try and catch block in Java. So if I apply try, if I try my method call in the try block and then I add a statement which will handle, I will add a catch statement which will handle the exception, and exception in this case is file not found exception. So let me write that. E dot. So this is just I am printing the exception in my stack trace. Now if you see, if I add some statement even after this compile time program, compile time method, that will be executed because in this case I have handled my exception. Exception handled. Now if I run my program, so you can see it has thrown the exception, but it have not stopped the execution. It has went to the next statement. So this is how exception is handled. So if I'm not using this try catch here, and if I execute it without it, you will see it will not go to the next statement here. Okay, so this is how exception can be handled. Now in try catch block there is one more block, which is finally block. So what is the use of finally block? So finally block is used to execute something irrespective of exception caught or not at the end of this try. So that is, if I add a finally block here, so inside final, so this block will be executed even if there is exception or even if there is not exceptions. So if I run this, you can see first it went to the finally block and printed inside final, and then it went to the next statement. Now let me try to remove this exception. Let me try adding the runtime method here, and let's see, is it executing when there is no exception? So if I add something in the string, it will not throw me the runtime exception, which is the null pointer exception. Just a minute, there's some error. Okay, so it is telling me like it can't throw the file not found exception, so I am adding a generic exception here. Just a minute. As my file not found was a compile time exception, so it was telling me to remove that because this runtime method can't throw that. There's no statement here which will be throwing that file not found exception, so I just removed it and added a generic exception here. Okay, so now if I run my program, so you will see even without the exception finally block is executed. It is possible that I may not have any catch block to my try block if finally block is present, or even I can have multiple catch blocks like catch exception e like this. Then I can have one more catch block where I will be capturing some other exception. Currently it is giving me error because I'm using the same exception class. I have to use the exception in the proper way so that I can use the multiple exception catch blocks, like if I use this compile time exception, I can use file not found exception, then you can see I can use multiple catch blocks as well. So this is how you can handle the exception in Java. Now there is one more keyword left, which is throw keyword. So throw keyword is used to explicitly throw some exception in your method or in your program. So for example, if I want to throw some exception here, even my code is not throwing any exception, but I want to throw some exception, I will say throw new, let's say file not found exception. I'm telling my program to explicitly throw some exception. Okay, as soon as I add the throw exception, throw keyword, it is asking me to add the throws declaration in the method, so that my method is aware, so that my compiler is aware that this method is throwing this exception. So this is how throw and throws can be used. So this is all about the exception handling in Java. Now let us learn about one more concept in exception handling, which is exception propagation. By exception propagation I mean, for example, I am having three methods in my Java program. My method 1 is calling method 2 and method 2 is calling method 3. Okay, and my method 3 is something which has thrown the exception. Okay, so that means even if that exception is not caught in method 3, if we caught that exception in method 1, which is calling method 2, and then method 2 is calling method 3, that way exception can propagate from one method to another, that is method calling chain. But only unchecked exception can propagate, not the checked exceptions. Let us see with the example. To see this, I have created this example. Here you can see like my runtime method is throwing a runtime exception or the unchecked exception. Okay, and my runtime method is being called in method 1, and then my method 1 is being called in method 2. Okay, and I'm handling that particular exception in the method 2 basically. I'm handling that exception in the not in the method 1, not in the runtime exception, but handling it in the method 2. But exception is thrown here exactly in this method. Okay, so this is what is called exception propagation. For your unchecked exception propagates from the calling chain, but this is not same in case of your compile time exception. So if I use compile time exception here, okay, even I have handled that compile time like exception in the method 2, even it is telling me to add the throws declaration, that is compile time exception can't be propagated. So this is all about exception handling in Java. I hope you guys are able to understand. In case you have any questions, please post it over the video comments. We will try our best to answer those questions.